Herzlich willkommen. Ist das an? Ja. Herzlich willkommen. A very warm welcome to all of you, and an especially warm welcome to our distinguished guest, Kohei Saito. Kohei Saito is a professor at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Tokyo. He is the author of multiple books, including the international bestseller Slow Down, the Degrowth Manifesto, which has made him famous, I would say. The German translation of his most recent book, Marx in the Anthropocene, has just been published in May 25. And there's a new book to come that is called Collapse Socialism, which is a book that he has been working on. The sound is not quite good. During the year that he has spent in Hamburg here at the New Institute as a program chair of a group that is called Beyond Capitalism. And maybe I should also mention that he is an alumni of Humboldt University. So he received his PhD at Humboldt University. We could actually do the whole lecture and Q&A also in German, because he spent quite a lot of years at Humboldt University. I'm very happy to have him back here and to have you here and to listen to your lecture. Kohei will give his lecture, accompanied by a power presentation for about half an hour. Then we will have a discussion here at the podium, and then we'll open it up to the public for Q&A. Thank you so much. And welcome, Kohei.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm very glad to be back to Berlin, and I'm glad to be back to the Volksbühne. I remember the first year when I was a student at the Freie Universität. I did my master there. And then I took Jaeggi's class on Habermas, and then I came here to the book presentation on Hegel's Pebble by Frank Ruder. And there was a time that when that kind of discussion was taking place, and then I always wanted to present my own stuff here at the Volksbühne. So now I'm glad to be in this position tonight. And then so many young people came to this lecture. So the topic is about degrowth communism, but repeating the same book is kind of boring. So I kind of prepared a kind of further development of my argument about freedom. And I got some criticism basically that I overemphasize the break between the young Marx to like late Marx. So today I try to bridge some of this gap, and then try to re-evaluate young Marx's contribution to degrowth communism, and especially in terms of the concept of freedom. By emphasizing this concept of freedom, I want to make a contribution to the current ongoing debate on the concept of freedom in, say, socialism. This is kind of like popular topic recently. One is the Republican socialism. People like Bruno Leipold published a book and advocating this kind of the Republican freedom. And the other one is put forward by Martin Hegelund, Dieses Leben, maybe it's a This Life book, which advocates the expansion of free disposable time in socialism. And I basically want to present a different kind of freedom in late Marx, which I call ecological freedom. So what is it? Why is it important? I will try to explain in the following. And basically, I will first present these two more dominant conceptions of freedom by Republicans and Martin Hegelund or other people. And I will then defend my own interpretation of ecological freedom. And we can kind of divide Marx's intellectual formation into three stages: young Marx, mature Marx, and last Marx. And each stage has kind of different conception, Marx didn't really fully abandon one for the other. So there's of course continuation, but the emphasis changes, and then there's a kind of shift of emphasis according to this each stage. So early Marx is more Republican, mature Marx is more free time guy, and then late Marx is more ecological, basically. So it's very clear. First, young Marx and Republican freedom. So basically, it's about freedom as non-domination in contrast to freedom as non-interference. I mean, this is not necessarily socialist thing, but recently Republican socialists basically expand this concept to criticize capitalism, why capitalism is unfree. And this concept of non-freedom is basically non-domination is basically, even if you have like a very good slave owner, you're a slave and you have an owner, he's very generous, so he doesn't really tell you what to do. You can just read books and you can just cook and then sleep. But you're not free, according to the Republicans, because there's always these relations of domination. There's no actual interference, but when maybe the owner is in the bad mood and he's like, throw cups to you, and so this could happen. This is because of these relations of domination. And as long as this continues, you are not free. I mean, it makes sense. And then the point is basically that these people like Bruno Leipold or Robert Williams, expand this concept to criticize capitalism. There are three kinds of domination in capitalism, according to them. One is political domination by the capitalist state, very oppressive state. If you go to demonstration, you see this. And the second one is obviously the objective domination by capitalists. You are workers, you are exploited. This is the relations of domination, so you are unfree. But then the third one is the domination by the market. So it's kind of reification, and you are, controlled by the market law, price goes up and down, you lose job because of the economic crisis. And these are also the kind of unfreedom that they basically problematize. And so the Republican socialists argue that we have to overcome these three forms of domination and the exercise of arbitrary power. And then in order to establish non-alienated and free activities in favor of more democratic self-determination and self-actualization. And mainly this is more young Marx, but of course if you look at the Paris Commune and the Civil War in France, he kind of comes back to this kind of idea anyway. So Marx's project of democratic socialism is a social republic that radically democratizes representation and public administration in both political and economic spheres of collective social life. There's more autonomy, more democracy. This is the vision of Marx's freedom, according to Republicans. The second one, the more popular one, is free disposable time, is something that you find mainly or most clearly in the Grundrisse. And then people like Goltz talk about this, but recently put forward by Martin Hegelund too. And this is basically, in capitalism, there's a competition, and there will be always the competition for higher productive forces because you get some extra surplus value and so on. But then what happens is that you have much higher capacity of production, so that each commodity actually contains less and less value. You have to sell more. But your desire is actually, human desires cannot be infinite. So in order to simply satisfy your desire, you actually don't have to work. We don't actually have to work like 8 hours every day. But capitalism compels us to work because that's the source of value, right? So there is this tension that the more the capitalism develops, there's more and more conditions for free time. But the capitalism compels us to give up our free time. We actually want to do other things, but it just doesn't realize this kind of freedom. So that's why Marx basically said that this is stupid. We have to overcome and then enjoy, drink more beer and so on. So this is the kind of the free time argument. I'm very simplifying, but you get the image, and it's fine because I will criticize them anyway. So. Why is this problematic? I mean, these two things, you have a lot of, discussion on this, and they are, of course, important. But the problem is according to people like Murray Bookchin, more like ecological thinkers, they always criticized Marx's freedom because it's too anthropocentric and productivist, basically. And he says, for example, already in the 80s, so it's almost 50 years ago, he said, humanity, in Marx's view, transcends domination only ambivalently by dominating nature. nature is reduced to the slave, as it were, of a harmonized society, like socialism or communism. And the self does not annul its Promethean content. Thus, the theme of domination is still latent in Marx's interpretation of communism. Nature is still the object of human domination. So basically, workers become free by making nature slave. So this is too anthropocentric, and it's just Promethean, productivist, and it doesn't pay attention to ecological crisis. But Murray Bookchin also expands this because of this domination of nature will also result in the domination of women in socialism and so on. So that's why he goes for another more ecological anarchist view and so on. And the problem is, these two recent popular ideas of freedom don't really respond to this kind of criticism. Republicans, they only talk about human relations, social relations. They don't talk about nature. So it's pretty much useless if you want to talk about this kind of thing, right? Ecology, climate change, and so on. That's the obvious problem. And the other one, the free time, is also very problematic because this idea that you have to, it's better to have more free time. It means that you have to automate things, you have to have higher productive capacity, machines, and so on. That could create, of course, a lot of tension with kind of, ecological ideas, like domination over nature, more extraction of resources for automation and AI, and that, instrumentalization of nature and so on. This is much, not so strong as a topic in Hägglund, but if you look at other people like Matt Huber, Aaron Bastani, William Nietzsche, and these people, like more eco-modernist people, argue for domination of nature in favor of free time. And then there are obviously cases where you have to kind of sacrifice free time for the sake of ecological concerns. You have to take train instead of airplanes and so on. So it's, there's some tension. But this theory of free time doesn't really give us what should we do and what kind of freedom we actually achieve by taking train instead of airplanes and so on. And I think this is, not only their fault, but also Marx's own fault, because their discussion are mainly based on the, up until mainly Grundrisse, maybe volume 1 of Capital, but he, at the time, was still often productivist and Eurocentric. Only after 68 and so on, he becomes much more conscious on these kind of issues. So if you look at Capital, the volume 3, in the famous passage, you actually find some problematic tension here. It's the freedom, the realm of freedom, realm of necessity that everyone knows. The realm of freedom only begins where labor determined by necessity and external expediency ends. It lies by its very nature beyond the sphere of material production proper. Freedom in this sphere can consist only in this, that the socialized man, the associated producers govern the human metabolism with nature in a rational way, bringing it under the collective control and so on. Accomplishing it with the least expenditure of energy, so minimum resources, minimum time, and its condition most worthy of their human nature. But this always remains a realm of necessity. And then the true realm of freedom, the development of human powers as an end in itself, begins only beyond this point. So the reduction of the working day is the basic prerequisite. So basically Marx is saying that you have to reduce the working hours for the sake of true realm of freedom. Here, Marx seems to be falling into some kind of dualism, because alienated labor in capitalism is obviously unfree. You're exploited, you are, just suffer from shitty works and so on. But unalienated labor, you kick out capitalists, you make associations and so on. But it's not truly free, because it's still the realm of necessity. And the realm of freedom, in which our activity is an end in itself, begins only after that point. The realm of necessity is only the means to maintain your life. And so here, there's obviously hierarchical division. The realm of freedom is higher, more important, more human than the realm of necessity. And that's why you have to eliminate the lower, inferior realm of nature or necessity for the sake of human emancipation. And here you see actually there's still the tacit modern kind of opposition of society, nature, freedom, necessity, as well as productive labor and a non-productive nature and so on. And that's something I find problematic. And Marx projected basically the problematic capitalist worldview to the future society, even though it has to be more radical. He kind of hides or even strengthens the existing structural problem, like nature is subordinated to human and this kind of thing. And that also has to do with this anthropocentric productivist attitude as well as the neglect of reproductive work. The reproductive work, child care, it's a lot of work, but it's also fun. So it can be means and ends. So these are activities that can be both realm of necessity and realm of freedom. But Marx's strict division of these two realms doesn't allow us to conceptualize reproductive labor, for example. On the same with ecology, you have to take up nature, and it's a lot of work, but maybe fun. The problem of ecology, the reproductive labor, and these kind of things is kind of marginalized and remain depoliticized in communism. It's not very revolutionary, right? You have to go beyond this kind of modern or capitalist hierarchy. So luckily, Marx recognized this problem. That's why I kind of like later Marx. We can debate, but yes, that's basically the position. Because he actually started to more self-reflexively start to study, for example, natural sciences and also non-Western societies in order to think more about ecology and in order to think more about his problematic Eurocentrism. So that's the project of rethinking some of his problematic assumptions. One of the results, I'm not going into the detail of this because I don't have time. One of the results you already see in the critique of the Gotha program. Here, he also talks about communist society, but this problematic dualism disappears because he says in the following way. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and thereby also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only the means of life, but also life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-round development of the individual, all the spring of commonwealth, genossenschaftlicher Reichtum, flow more abundantly. Only then can we say that this is real communism from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. So it's very subtle, but actually here Marx changes his view because the importance of transforming the content of work by abolishing the excessive division of labor as well as the abolishing the separation of conception and execution and so on, labor becomes much more fun. Labor becomes not only the means of sustaining your life, but it becomes the way of self-actualization, the realization of freedom, and then the labor becomes the life's prime want. So there is no strict division of freedom of necessity and the sphere of necessity and sphere of freedom. Rather, there is the point is basically creating a truly satisfactory work for everyone and sharing burdens in a more democratic way, including cares. So then labor becomes a meaningful activity and the end in itself. There's no more strict dualism. And also productivism is no longer necessary because here he doesn't talk about reducing labor time anymore, because life's prime want is your labor. So you can actually spend more time at workplace, maybe, to do. It's also good to, spend more time with kids, right? Not always, but so it's, there's no productivist, this idea of elimination of labor as a condition for freedom and so on. So this is a very actually big change for his ideas. And the other big change for him is also abandoning productivism. Is basically here he talks about this kind of abundance of genossenschaftlicher Reichtum. It's a kind of commonwealth, not the abundance of material goods and like private jets and so on. It's about sharing and helping each other, and that creates the condition for the abundance of communism, satisfying basic needs for everyone, and then creating, the free, more democratic decision making and so on. These are the kind of the idea that doesn't require constant increase of productive forces in socialism. So that's more compatible with my idea of degrowth communism. But this is not the whole story. So this is kind of like my final point is that then what kind of freedom do we actually defend? This is the point. So here in the 70s, Marx intensively also studied non-Western societies like Iroquois Federation in North America. And in the famous letter to Zasulich in the 1881, Marx basically, the Zasulich, the Russian revolutionary, asked whether the Russian society have to go through all the process of industrialization and the law of history to, feudalism to socialism applies to Russia. We have more communal production and communal property based on the agricultural communities. Do we have to destroy? Isn't it Eurocentric? Basically, that's the question that the Zasulich asked to Marx, right? And then he answers that no, it's not the case because the historical inevitability of the law of capitalist development that I discussed in Capital is expressly limited to the countries of Western Europe, so not Russia or Asia, Africa. If the Russian Revolution actually becomes the signal for the proletarian revolution in the West, so that the two complement each other, then Russia's peasant commune land ownership may serve as the point of departure for the communist development. So actually, Russia can start the new history toward post-capitalism. It's not that they have to wait until the Germans and the British people stand up and then they follow. It's very Eurocentric. But then now here he says, actually, the Russian people, it's the same with Indian society. Actually, he basically changes that these kind of rebellion against Western capitalism may create the new conditions for socialist development. But my point is, it's not simply that the path to socialism or communism becomes plural, Western path, Russian path, and then maybe Japanese path, Korean path, and so on. But I argue that if the path changes, actually the content of socialism must change. Otherwise, you cannot have the same thing always, and then the path changes. I think when the goal changed, so the path changed too. And here, this is the direction that when Marx going toward the degrowth direction, he says, capitalism faces a crisis in both Western Europe and the United States because it is in conflict with science, the popular masses, working class, and with the very productive forces it generates. In short, in a crisis. And the crisis of capitalism, then how do we overcome this? It will only end through its own elimination, negation of negation, of course, but through the return of the modern societies, like Germany, British, France, to a higher form of an archaic type of collective ownership and production. This is something I already discussed in other books, but basically he's saying that the Western path, Western society have to basically go back to non-Western societies or its own past, right? It's a more communal production, and he's emphasizing return. And why? Why don't we maximize industrialization, modernization? It might be more fun and good life, but he actually doesn't think in that way. It's because of freedom. He passionately emphasizes the kind of the pre-capitalist form of freedom. For example, he read Henry Morgan's Ancient Society, and he takes notes. And then here, one of the passages, he says, that Morgan actually says, and this is from Marx's notebook, the time will come when the human intelligence will rise to the mastery over property. So in capitalism, people become more egoistic and so on, but the dissolution of society bids fair to become the termination of a career of which property is the end and aim. So this is capitalism. Because such a career contains the element of self-destruction. In a higher plan of society will be the revival, so it's basically return, in the higher form of the liberty, equality, and fraternity of the ancient gent, ancient communities. So basically Marx, when he tells Zasulich about the necessity to return to the ancient society, he's imitating Morgan's idea, right? So, but then what kind of freedom do we actually witness here? So that's my question. And he actually has another passages in his notebook where he also talks about liberty again in the Iroquois Federation. All the members of Iroquois gens, personally free, bound to defend each other's freedom, equal in privileges and personal rights, Sahan and chiefs claiming no superiority, a brotherhood bound together by the ties of the king. And here there's a liberty, equality, and fraternity, though never clearly formulated, what the cardinal principles of gens, and they kind of, defended each other and so on. So here again, this idea of freedom. You understand the equality and fraternity in these communities, right? But what kind of freedom? They look more, unfree maybe. So we have to investigate this issue a little bit more. So go back to the letter that the Marx sent to the Zasulich, actually the manuscript, but in the one of the draft letter, Marx mentions Georg von Maurer. He is a German law of historian, German historian of law. And here he also talks about liberty again. This is a passage I read. More importantly, we find the clear imprint of this agrarian commune so clearly traced on the new commune which emerged from it that the Maurer was able to reconstruct the former while working to decipher the latter. So there's actually even the pre-capitalist communes, there are two stages, but basically the second stage is so still relevant in the Middle Ages in Germany. So Maurer was looking at that, the second older one, to reconstruct the former one. The new commune, the more recent one, in which cultivable land is privately owned by the producers, while the forests, pastures, waste, common ground, these are the commons, right, still remain communal property, was introduced by Germans to all the countries that they conquered. Thanks to the certain features borrowed from its prototype of this Germanic type, it became the only kernel of popular life and liberty throughout the Middle Ages. So in the, if you go to Scandinavian countries, German and mountain areas, you always find that kind of common properties, and that is still much more present at the time. And he's basically saying this is the basis for the liberty of the mass of the people during the Middle Ages. And Maurer was actually very important for Marx. Already in the 68, and after reading Maurer's book, he tells Engels his excitement about Maurer's book. This is a passage from the letter in March 1868. He says, all historians are then surprised to find what is newest in what is oldest. So what is newest means something about socialism and communism in the oldest, in the ancient Germanic society, communes. And even egalitarians like Proudhon shudder. And we are all very much in the clutches of the judicial blindness, but we didn't really recognize until we read Maurer's book, right? So that's what the judicial blindness that Marx didn't pay enough attention. Right in my neighborhood, actually, there is a, he comes from the, the Hunsrück region, and then it's a Rhine province. The old Germanic system survived until the recent years, and I remember my father talking about this from the lawyer point of view, right? So he actually, that kind of commons and communal property, communal production, the tradition, history, everything actually quite, traceable at the time. But Marx says, oh, I didn't pay enough attention, so what a shame, right? Because this could be the basis for imagining a new society. So that's how he started to study more non-Western pre-capitalist society in the 70s. So that's Maurer is one of the turning point for his intellectual development. But interestingly, so this is the kind of final section. Interestingly, if you go back to the much earlier Marx, like young Marx in the beginning of 40s, so this is how I try to overcome this divide. Actually, this is not always the case. I mean that the Marx actually paid attention to this kind of local practice of commons and communal property in this Rhine province, because he was a kind of passionate defender of the common property in the 40s in the Rheinische Zeitung, the famous article, The Debates on Law and Theft on Wood. Here, Marx discussed the customary rights of the poor, traditional rights, of which various Germanic rights can be considered the most prolific source. So this is from 40s, but he actually sounds like 68, right? And basically the history is the Diet and the Rhine region decided to ban the common practice of collecting wood in the interest of the landlord class. And then at the time, more Republican Marx basically criticized this new law as the arbitrary exercise of the power, political power. So he says, these legislations are necessarily one-sided, for all customary rights of the poor were based on the fact that certain forms of property were indeterminate in character, for they were not definitely private property, but neither were they definitely common property, being a mixture of private and public right, such as we find in the old institution of the Middle Ages. So this is, the wood, river, fish, mushrooms, wood. These things are actually, cannot be private property. It's not something that someone can fully control. So, the power of nature escapes that kind of legislative control. Here, illegal, this is legal. And that kind of drawing a line is not possible because the nature's power belongs to the category of Zufall, according to Marx's expression, which eludes basically human control. He says, the fortuitous arbitrary action of privileged individuals by the landowners is replaced by the fortuitous operation of the power of nature. And this power of nature transcends human control, human power. Customary rights basically is the way of dealing with this power of nature. It's not limited simply to wood. It can include fish in the river, rabbits in the field, acorns and mushrooms in the forest. And that kind of common property created the conditions for the intimate gemütliche ties, Beziehung, of man with the earth. So that's how Marx actually talks about this liberty of the masses throughout the Middle Ages, thanks to this kind of the communal properties. Or it's more like a gift from nature that you cannot simply produce, right? You cannot produce the fish in the river. So pre-capitalist societies are fundamentally characterized by actually propertylessness. We often think that capitalism is characterized by propertyless relations of the workers, but also pre-capitalist societies are characterized by propertylessness. But it's of course different kind, because this is something beyond private and common properties. What I mean is basically it is not human agency that created this equality, liberty, and fraternity in the Middle Ages, because commons, the common property, is also embedded in a much wider environment. Right? You have maybe some fields, cultivatable, arable lands, but beyond this, you have much more bigger fields and forests and the rivers. These are not something that controlled as communal property at all. The ecological liberty that people in the pre-capitalist time enjoyed is embedded in the uncontrollable power of nature. So this is something what I call ecological freedom. It is ecological in the sense that it's giving up an absolute domination of nature and the conscious regulation of human metabolism with nature. It's not something possible that you can do. It's too far, it's fortuitous power. Ecological freedom is rather the freedom from the will surrendering to the fortuitous power of nature that eludes human control, law, and institutionalization. I'm not saying institutionalization is not important and so on. We do need, but we also have to recognize this kind of otherness of nature. And this is very different from the modern hierarchical binary of society, nature, freedom, necessity, as well as active labor and passive nature. So human agency is not fully powerful to control the power of nature. It's also not the freedom that overcomes the nature's power. It's everything is much more blurred, right? Society is embedded in nature and so on. Even the commons are embedded in the wider natural environment, without which communal luxury of the commons cannot exist. And awe and respect to nature was thus the common attitude in the pre-capitalist societies. However, basically in the capitalism, we lost this kind of feelings or attitude, and capitalism commodify nature and annihilates the intimate tie of the poor with nature. The recognition of the uncontrollability of nature and the finiteness of humans must be rehabilitated. That's basically the Marx's idea of degrowth communism or ecological freedom. He says in the Paris manuscript, this communism as fully developed naturalism equals humanism, and as fully developed humanism equals naturalism. It is this genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature, between man and man. So, conclusion is basically, Marx's engagement with natural science and non-Western society opens up the new vision of post-capitalism, which I call degrowth communism. And in degrowth communism, instead of transcending natural limits, Marx came to endorse limits as the foundation of freedom, which I call ecological freedom. And this is because the humans have, of course, body. The humans are also natural beings. And as a vulnerability is the ontological condition of humans. I think this is the main characteristic of materialism. And the poor is much more conscious of this vulnerability, because they are poor. The poor can establish communism, according to Marx, because they are much more conscious of this vulnerability, and thus created a society where they help each other, sharing limited resources, and organize common property and production for everyone. And that's how they basically enjoyed the ecological freedom. And basically, so what I want to say is this kind of the democracy of poor was the condition of ecological freedom. And this is something that is totally destroyed in the Anthropocene. But accepting the finiteness and limit, which is of course not compatible with capitalist imperative of infinite capital accumulation. This is the condition for ecological and decolonial vision of communist freedom. Marx's degrowth communism is his first attempt to put forward such a non-dualist vision of freedom, which however remained unfinished. So now it's our task to elaborate on its implication for the revival of critical theory and the collective survival on this finite planet in the Anthropocene. Thank you so much.
I'm sure this comes as a surprise for most of you to read Marx as a degrowth communist and to think of the democracy of the poor as a solution for our ecological problems, but also for a new way of living together. So let's get into the discussion. Thomas and I have already started to discuss a bit of your approach, and we have, a couple of questions actually. So first of it, I mean, I have to confess I'm not yet convinced by this idea that Marx is a degrowth communist, or that he seriously wants to go back to a return to pre-capitalist forms of life, the kind of face-to-face rural communities that he used to make fun of, actually. I mean, of course, everyone remembers this line in the Communist Manifesto where he says, so I mean, the great thing about capitalism is that it enables us to get rid of the idiocy of rural life. And the question now is, why would he now want to go back? And the kind of turning point that you described, I mean, I have some philological doubts here about the status of these notes and of the status of whether this really means that he wants to go back. But I don't think that we should go all too deep into the philological questions, because no matter what Marx, I mean, no matter what the late Marx had in mind, or what kind of turn or what kind of craziness has come over him, the question is whether this is a way to go for us, I would say. So maybe we focus on this a bit. I mean, one last thing about the Marx, I mean, about presenting this as a Marx reading. In some way, I think, why take Marx at a point where, even if this was true, why take him at a point where he in some way is the least interesting? When you, nein, I mean, I do not want to say that that the lecture is not interesting, but as for Marx, I mean, when Marx entered the scene, the political scene, so to say, I mean, anti-capitalism was all over the place. There was a lot of suffering from these early forms of capitalism. There were a lot of social movements. There was a lot of protest. There was what in German we call Maschinenstürmerei, so those people who destroyed the machinery in order to get rid of like the kind of domination from capitalism and so on. There were anarchists. There were all sorts of people who wanted to go back to pre-capitalist forms of life. And I always thought, but this might be my totally old-fashioned and somehow boring reading, that what he brought, I mean, his contribution, it was not the only one who did this, but one of Marx's contribution was to take all these, I mean, the way that capitalism destroys forms of life, to take this into account, to analyze how it exploits people and human nature, but still not to go back to some idealized pre-modern form of life, but to come up with an idea of an industrial, modern form of life that is still based on solidarity and the idea that economy should fulfill the needs of people, and that we would be in a community where we fulfill each other's needs, as he says. So, and the kind of freedom that comes from this sociality, from being part of those social institutions. So I wonder why he would, I mean, why one would now read him as someone who, I mean, then could have somehow remained within these like romantic anti-capitalism. The question then is, what kind of freedom is this freedom? Would this freedom, as you read it, still be a modern kind of freedom in the modern sense that then transcends certain boundaries and develops a specific relation to nature, or would you give up on some aspects of the modern freedom here? So history is another question here. I mean, your other thesis is that Marx gives up on historical materialism here. So that instead of saying, yeah, of course, we have these moments of and dimensions of equality and freedom and a certain kind of relation to nature, this might or might not have been, this might or might not have been so gemütlich. I would say that Marx thinks it's not actually so intimate, the kind of relation to nature that you have when you are in constant like anxiety about what will happen next and what can we do against it and so on. Yeah, so the question is what kind of is going back even an option? And you seem to think that he leaves the Hegelian dialectic and the Hegelian idea of a negation of the negation and just thinks, okay, so there have been these previous forms of life, let's go back to them, that's the solution. And I somehow doubt it, and I even doubt that the Vera Sasulic thing tells us more than that there are different paths, there are different starting points, and this is an interesting, an interesting point that at least goes against lazy, deterministic reading of Marx's historical materialism to allow for, let's say, a pluralism, a diversity of, a multiplicity of of starting points and also of historical time, so to say. So that one would say, there are still certain logics of transition into place. There is a certain way in which you might get from one point or from one social formation to the other, but it has not been the same. It's not something like that goes from one stage to the other, and we can predefine those stages. And if you don't have reached this stage, then you have to repeat it and so on. So I take this point from the Vera Sasulic thing. I still don't think that he romanticizes it in the way that somehow lurks between the lines here. Last point about nature. I would really be interested to discuss a bit more the kind of relation to nature that you have in mind, because you yourself, you do not want to go for like a new monism, like nature and culture and spirit and nature, this is all one. And so if what we have to learn is that this is a metabolism, then it's that we have to rearrange or have a more rational way in which we arrange the metabolism with nature. I would say this is still a relation. It's still, I mean, it cannot be a unity. It cannot be this, again, romanticized unity. It's still a relation, and then one has to figure out what the adequate relation here is. And last question, what is so wrong about productivism? And you do read the early Marx into the late Marx here, if you start from Marx's idea of labor as a certain kind of interaction with nature that is actually not bound up with purely instrumental reason and a certain kind of dominance, but with something that in which human beings gain their, I mean, change nature, but change themselves by changing nature. So they develop themselves, they develop something out of their environment. So why would there be a problem if you also take into account that that labor itself has to take into account what you seem to think of as in German it would be Widerständigkeit. So the fact that nature has a life of its own, has some source of resistance, is something that you cannot just plan on, and so where everything that arbitrarily can happen can just be discussed away or so. So I would argue for, and this is where I mean your idea of labor as something that is not just in opposition to freedom seems to match this very well. But this is still some kind of productivism, I would say. I mean, not productivism in the bad sense, but I wonder whether productivism or the idea that there's an actual exchange instead of being a passive victim of nature. And this is something that, again, lurks behind the lines when you talk about the Holzdiebstahlsgesetz and about the way that nature just somehow occurs, happens to us, and we then have to react. But I would think that within productivity and labor, rightly done, not in a capitalist mode of domination, but rightly done, there's exactly the need to balance out dependence and independency, and to take into account the character of what you are dealing with, reacting, being responsive to, and so on. I mean, every single kind of labor that you have ever involved in somehow already implies this responsiveness, I would say.
I think those were lots of questions, so maybe we should give him a chance to answer before I come back with some additional ones, I think.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. I mean, philosophy is often about definition, so we can always go back to the definition. Like, for example, degrowth, right? I mean, when I understand when I talk about degrowth communism, people often imagine this kind of a more pre-capitalist, idealized form of life, because I use this kind of example based on Marx's own discussion. But even in those parts, Marx actually, when he talks about return, he talks about not returning to those rural agrarian communes. He's emphasizing the higher form, right? So this, in a Hegelian way, I want to emphasize this higher form is very important. So this is not going back to primitive life without technology, without electricity and so on. This is absurd because in order to also decarbonize our economy, we need renewable energies, electric vehicles, and all those new technologies too. But with degrowth mindset or degrowth structure, because in capitalism, these new technologies are often utilized for the sake of making more profit out of this, and that will slow down the process of decarbonization. So I would still say that we still have to kind of learn from the non-Western modern, like pre-capitalist societies in the various ways, including idea of freedom, as I try to emphasize today. But that doesn't mean that Marx basically idealized those societies as harmonious, free, non-conflictual society. Marx studied enough to recognize there are, of course, various problems because of lack of technology, because of the conservativeness of those broad connected, kings and so on. But at the same time, as we also today, we try to learn, decolonize our view. We try to learn from the indigenous people, global South, Latin America. It's pretty much the same. I mean, what Marx was trying to do. I think for me that this last Marx, late Marx, is most interesting because this situation that Marx was trying to do, think, is very similar to our time. One is that after the defeat of Paris Commune, the things became very conservative and reactionary, and that's pretty similar. And the second, the problem that he confronted at the time, the capitalist modernization is basically failing. It's associated with more extractivism, more colonization, more brutal, oppression, and so on. And these are the issues that Marx had to reflect upon. He was too optimistic about technology, too optimistic about these more Western progress ideas, which is very similar today, right? We actually witness many problems because of this capitalist development, because of the one-sidedness of Western ideas. And for me, I think what Marx tried to do, even though he doesn't tell us the full answer to this, but at least his attitude to learn from these things also give us some ways to redefine or develop further what Marx remained basically unfinished. So one thing is basically, for example, Marx not only simply recognized the plural path to socialism in Russia, in India, in Germany and so on. Rather, I think he also, what I wanted to emphasize, he also saw the continuity, right? In the Middle Ages in Germany, we actually, but you actually had something very similar to those Russian communes. That's why Marx thought that, okay, that's why we can still learn from those Russian people too. If it's totally different, we cannot learn. But there's some connection, there's some tradition, but that's what's so totally destroyed, annihilated, and that's something Marx really studied hard to reconstruct those things. And I think maybe that's something very useful today too. And about productivism, but I have to say that the danger of productivism is very clear if you look at people like Matt Huber. They talk about nuclear fusion and mining in the space, and these kind of crazy ideas really simply is the projection of our current idea of good life, the material wealth and so on. This is not very revolutionary. I mean, of course, we need certain technologies. We need certain, material wealth. We have to still extract. So in that sense, we still destroy the planet. But at the same time, we have to recognize first, we are also part of the nature. This is one point. But the nature is not something that we can fully instrumentalize. So that's the more, again, the Hegelian Identität, the Identität und Nicht-Identität that I discuss in my book. The human metabolism with nature is, of course, embedded in the universal metabolism of nature, but it is also a very distinctive form of metabolism with nature. And the productivism basically tried to eliminate this non-identity of nature. And what happens is basically that kind of elimination of non-identity will come back to us. And that's how we suffer from various kinds of unfreedom, and one obvious one is climate change, and this is really the return of nature, because the nature is not something in the end, not something that you can control fully. So I would say that this kind of the otherness and the Nicht-Identität dimension is very much missing in the productivist discourse. And rather what I wanted to emphasize the ecological freedom is basically because of this non-identity of nature, people, at least in the past, enjoyed this kind of freedom and unity or sharing. And we still do have to recognize this again today because of the climate change. And then that's not necessarily the negation of our freedom. Rather, this is the beginning of then what kind of the freedom do we build? It's probably not the kind of autonomy that transcends all the natural boundaries and so on, right? Because we are always the sensuous being. And that's, I think, very interesting that Marx, of course, doesn't really discuss this kind of philosophical issues in the 70s and 80s, but that's why I try to go back to the young Marx. So I'm not saying that the young Marx is boring, it's very, very important. But I think there are things that we can only learn from the 70s and 80s. The other thing is the rentier capitalism that I discussed yesterday. But there are many things that still we can explore and learn.
Okay, thank you so much. So I really appreciated the clarification you made in the beginning about technology and so on. And I just wanted to highlight that we had the opportunity to read the manuscript, so I should make this public that we had that. But so reading the manuscript, I had the impression that that in a certain sense one could get the impression that you want to reject a certain kind of developmental approach, that this developmental approach is part of what Marx is about, even the late Marx. And even in the passages that you have, in the letters, but also in the critique of the Gotha program, it's all about the development of the productive forces of the individual. So that we are supposed to develop ourselves, become ever more expansive in our capacities. That, it seems to me, Marx has no worries about that. So it's not about this kind of, if we mean by productivism, developing our complexity, our capacities, that's not exactly what it goes against, but rather, growth seems to be, the growth imperative seems to be the problem there, and a certain kind of instrumentalization of nature. So I think that was very, very helpful for me, the way you clarified this. I want to ask two questions with regard to nature and to freedom. So more open-ended questions in terms of how you see things there. So you were describing the kind of vision, I start with freedom because you ended there. The kind of freedom you envision is an ecological kind of freedom. And I would really like to learn a little bit more about what you think this is and why this is. Sometimes it sounds just like a quite modest program where we have our certain individual or human freedom, and now we have to recognize that we are embedded in nature. So there's certain limits. That's the title of the event today, so freedom within limits. So there's a certain kind of external limit that we have to recognize. If we don't, we mess up, that's fine. But it's still our freedom and a certain kind of limitation from outside. Ecological freedom sounds like more. It sounds like in my relation to nature, in my relation to this otherness, I become something else. I gain a new type of freedom. And so I would just wanted to invite you to say more on this front. And maybe it helps to use a contrast you used in the presentation. So in the mature Marx of the Capital, Marx already has the idea there's this kind of Stoffwechsel metabolism between man and nature. And what we ought to do is we should organize it rationally. Right? Self-consciously. This already seems to include, I'm aware of the limits that nature poses to me. I don't undermine its cycles of self-reproduction. But it seemed to me now ecological freedom wanted something more, or has a doubt about how, if this is just a question of rational control, but something else. Maybe I'll just let you answer that. I have a question about nature too, but that's...
That's actually very helpful because sometimes, yes, degrowth people argue for the recognition of limit, respecting planetary boundaries and so on. And then, yes, as Rahel also pointed out, it's sometimes very primitive, anti-technological kind of eco-village style of life. and don't change nature so much. And it's very conservative. It can be very conservative. If you read, for example, Ecofeminism by Maria Mies and Vandana Shiva, they kind of argue something like that. We respect the nature and we just remain within the kind of our boundaries, don't change so much. And I think that's also very problematic, conservative, and it can even be reactionary because nature is not something that we are allowed to change, and that can be utilized against homosexuality or against racism, like for racism, and many problems. So I think Thomas pointed out a very important point that the ecological freedom is not about that. It's about enriching, deepening freedom or our capacity, the freedom to develop our capacity in various ways through our metabolic interaction with nature. So in this process, we still have to change a lot of things about nature. We have to extract lithium and other cobalt and the resources in order to live sustainably, right? So I'm not saying that we have to simply go back to this primitive life, but rather we still have to work upon nature, but in a way that still recognizes the otherness or non-identity of nature. Only on this recognition, maybe is it possible to achieve certain kind of capabilities, capacities, certain kind of principles of society that allows us to recognize each other or recognize the right of nature, or something that creates new conditions that capitalism actually prevents us from achieving. I'm not. It's one of the example that I wanted to give with my lecture is basically that then it's no longer really the case that the automation is always the good thing, right? It's not the elimination of working hours. Rather, maybe it's good to spend more time doing care work or agricultural work or doing some ecological labor, basically. And these are the dimensions that, of course, in capitalism, marginalized because they are not profitable, but they are the ones that also allow us different kinds of meaning and capacities of our finite life. But that is only possible by recognizing how society is embedded into nature, and these are the power of nature that we cannot control, and so on, so on. So maybe that's the first step. But yeah, I think the concrete ways of realizing this can be much more plural.
We somehow had two readings. I mean, one that was more radical, or we think that there are two possible readings of what you say. One is more radical, and one is, less so. So one reading would be: this is still about a rational organization of our metabolism with nature, and with a broad concept of rationality here, meaning that it would be irrational not to take into account that you cannot control everything. It would be irrational not to take into account that certain resources are limited, or that certain things might fight back or have unintended consequences and so on. So with a broad and encompassing concept of rationality and the rational control over our metabolism with nature, you would take all this into account. This would still be a way to a certain way to remain in control. And the other reading is, and this comes up when you talk about this is not freedom of the will, but from the will, and where you also cite, Simon Critchley on mysticism. This seems to be more radical. I mean, and also when the way you interpret the Holzdiebstahlgesetz, there are parts where one thinks, okay, so this is more about, I don't know, a certain kind of relation between the active and the passive element here that says we should also be less active. I mean, whereas the broad concept of rational control is still a kind of activity, whereas you seem to plea for also to give way to this kind of, nature does what it does, let's, I don't know, endure it, or or even enjoy what happens without being in control.
So yes, I actually agree, and this is very good Einordnung. And yes, it's very helpful. But I think they can both coexist. I think this kind of ecological like immersion, ecological awareness often only emerges through the kind of recognition of your finiteness in the big natural ecosystem and so on. So there's a kind of the surrender, like a creaturely thing, is in a sense foundation for ecological consciousness and ecological freedom. And that was obviously much more dominant when the human power, human technology, human capacities were limited. And today we have the difficulty of recognizing that kind of superpower of nature because of the development of technology, but also because of the elimination of non-identity nature and the capitalism. So my idea is we, of course, have to still have some kind of regulation, like a rational, sustainable regulation, as long as we, as a human being, want to sustain the society. But at the same time, that is not possible without this kind of more deep ecological kind of consciousness. And I think that's something that the Marx tried to revive when he had to think more about when he was studying these non-Western pre-capitalist societies. But we often, if you read eco-socialist literature, especially more like eco-modernist people, they only talk about this rational regulation aspect. And then the degrowth people like Maria Mies, especially Vandana Shiva, is like really kind of deep ecology kind of idea. So what I try to do is kind of overcome this dualism or like this binary to present more kind of unified view. But I have to admit that these two are not very well connected. I kind of recognized after your comments.
Yeah, that explains why why we were puzzled on which side you're standing, because you stand on both sides. So that's that's good to know. Okay. One further question before we maybe come to the question what this actually means, what a politics of degrowth would mean. But I mean, maybe it's leading up to that. So what I found very interesting in your presentation is that this other relation to nature that's implied in ecological freedom seems to be connected, internally connected to a certain social, communal, cooperative structure. And that's the intuition that Marx has right from the start. So in the Paris manuscripts, he makes clear that the only way in which nature can resurrect is by virtue of our social relations. So a certain kind of social bond, that's the way for us to appreciate nature more. Now, the thought is fascinating, but why is that? So, I mean, if you're talking about an agricultural commune, okay, you see, okay, they're engaged with nature directly, so it seems has a certain kind of prima facie plausibility that they are closer to nature. But is it clear that, or why is it, or maybe you don't want to maintain it, but I had the thought you wanted to maintain that there's an internal connection between a communist, communal kind of sociality and another relation to nature. So yeah, it would just be interesting. Maybe you will have a more modest claim and say that there's no internal connection there. But it seemed to me that in a certain sense, it would be very Marxist to suggest that, because that would also mean, I mean, it could mean we can only solve this crisis of the Anthropocene, this ecological crisis, if we do become communist, because it's only by virtue of this social structure that we can actually make progress there. It's no other way. I'm not sure whether you would go so far, but I'm just interested to hear what your thoughts are there.
So like community, communes, and associations, all those kind of more free type of social relations, according to Marx, only exist because people are vulnerable. The workers are vulnerable, exploited. They cannot fight against capitalists alone, so they had to unite. The agricultural communes, they couldn't subsist without helping each other. So that kind of vulnerability is the condition for some kind of fraternity or solidarity. And why are they vulnerable? But basically, as I said in the lecture, because they are sensual bodily being.
And in that sense, the materialism is about this vulnerability of body and its fragileness. And this is often something that the capitalism, for example, tries to overcome so that we can live forever, or we can upload our consciousness to computers. We try to now negate those bodily constraints to go beyond, go to Mars and so on. But I would say, but this fragile vulnerability is the condition of this kind of social relations that goes beyond the capitalism. And I understand that why Marx was so much excited about these rural communes in the end, because these are something that really correlates with what Marx kind of witnessed, not personally, but witnessed in the Paris Commune too.
But then, so if I understood you correctly, just to point this out, then the kind of dependencies in the other way around. So you were saying a certain kind of vulnerability and its recognition creates a different kind of social relation. Not so much that the social, I mean, I understand the early Marx more like looking at the relation from the other side. A certain kind of social relation to others enables us seeing and recognizing nature differently. And just pointing out, you were rather looking in the other way, in the other direction, right? Having another grasp of nature can enable a different, I mean, recognizing our vulnerability can enable a different kind of social relation that's less competitive, more caring, and so on and so on.
But yeah, I mean, that sounds like very idealist. So maybe, yeah, I think it's good to actually. I mean, it's not like one-sided, right? It's I wouldn't say that you first have to go to like nature and a kind of like deep ecology and realize, and then you can build your own eco villages. But I would say that of course, even under the factory communal control, you kind of create the spaces where you actually find the importance of care works or other kind of dependence on environment and nature. So these are not, oh yes, the way I explained wasn't really good, but yeah, I think we would say it should be more mutual.
Both ways.
Yes, maybe that's.
I mean,
is
just
it okay?
because
if it's okay, I would say it's both ways.
But I mean, if you don't want to end up with Karl May instead of Karl Marx, then I do think we have to realize that there, I mean, a lot of those groups who live under scarcity and under, I mean, in a certain relation to nature, but still in a scarcity, are not actually all too democratic or non-violent or opposed to domination. Which brings me to the last part, actually, because you ended with democracy of the poor, and you took it from Holzdiebstahlsgesetz. I would say, I mean, Marx in Holzdiebstahlsgesetz, which is, I mean, I totally agree that this is one of the most interesting pieces. I mean, he wants to overcome poverty. So there is a customary right of the poor to collect wood, but this is not where he would stop, I would say. But in social relations, that would, where this customary right of the poor to collect wood would not even be necessary. Which brings us to the last, I mean, set of questions in part of our discussion, maybe degrowth communism. So I found it very helpful the way you spelled out that you are somehow in between this deep ecological stuff and eco-modernism. But then maybe you could tell us a bit more about how this would work out. You insist that it's not like Stone Age communism. You still want to have your iPhone. You still want to have refrigerators. But if you want all, I mean, the population of this world, that, what is it, 8 billion, 10 billion? So if you want to feed all of them, if you want all of them to have a refrigerator and an iPhone, then where does degrowth start and where does it have to stop? And what right do we have to say, okay, so we know we have our iPhones and our refrigerators, but you should restrain from it because that's an ecological disaster.
Yeah, so yes, it's very important to highlight that we have to have refrigerator. Because I mean, degrowth is not about simply abandoning technology. We are not anti-technology. We are talking about this infinite growth imperative that is now not making us happier, but also undermining the ecological conditions for civilization too. So basically the idea is the good life, decent life for everyone on this planet. And that's actually technically, of course, possible. But that, of course, requires the reduction of overconsumption, especially in the global north, meaning that, yes, we should reduce the number of, I don't know, the meat consumption, of course, but also not owning 2, 3 cars, not flying too many times. And so, I mean, for Germany and for Japan, it's probably some kind of reduction. And at the beginning, many people will really kind of hesitate to accept this idea. I understand. I mean, that's why degrowth is always unpopular. But at the same time, it's also very narrow-minded to reject this kind of proposal, because that means that we actually have the vision of freedom in a very capitalist, consumptionist way. I think degrowth provides, especially this idea of ecological freedom, for example, or communal luxury, presents a different kind of conception about how we can actually, you know, spend a good time, and by also enriching or developing our capacities more. So that's, I think, something, of course, there are also bad side that, you know, you really have to reduce. My friend talks about compulsory veganism, and I'm kind of against this, but there are, of course, good aspects that really emancipate us from today's this irrationality of overproduction, overconsumption, overworking hours, and the excessive inequality and so on.
Yeah, maybe just as a follow-up question. So, how do we make progress in implementing or realizing degrowth? Because you explained with Marx as a background the forcefulness of the idea, or in a certain sense, the inevitability of degrowth. But still, the world in which we live, we all seem to recognize this in some sense or form. Things need to change and can't go on like this, but nothing changes, right? I mean, some things change, also not always for the better. Yeah, so the question is, is it just a political process that we now need, or what kind of a transformation is needed in order to get closer to this? And I mean, this connects a little bit to my cooperation question. I had the sense that you wanted to suggest this, that certain types of social forms, cooperatives, kind of, bring us to the point where, in a certain sense, organically, a certain kind of degrowth is happening. Whereas this other kind of degrowth that we now, if we just politically postulate it, demand it, it's unclear how we would ever implement it. And so that also raises the specter of eco-dictatorship or something that would be needed. And I take it you don't want to go down that road. So how do we make progress in that direction?
My new book actually talks about ecological dictatorship, but that's something you read next year. But yes, because the problem is obviously, I think especially the book, the Systemschuld, is that, yes, of course it's important to emphasize the cooperatives, the municipalities and the more participatory democratic associations, and these are important. Without them, it's not possible to make a kind of democratic transformation. But at the same time, if you look at the scale of the crisis and this acceleration of the irrationality of the capitalist system today with Trump and Gaza and everything, it's really hard to imagine how somehow these eco-villages and cooperatives could save the planet. Well, these eco-villages might be the kind of the only remaining oasis, the surviving utopia under the desert, but that's not the best scenario. So in that sense, I should have talked more about infrastructures and so that kind of stuff. And I think one of the degrowth transformation that can, for example, achieve certain popularity in German context would be invest more in Deutsche Bahn. It's just crazy how so much delays are occurring and people, fly and take cars. And so, investing in the public transportation system and expansion of it, including bus system, is really the condition for degrowth transformation, reducing the number of private cars and flights and so on. So that's something that you can totally imagine on the scale that's also big enough to implement, to have significant impact, right? Of course, that's not enough. We have to ban the short distance flight at least, and also private jets and so on, but that's another thing. And the other point will be, for example, now the NATO is talking about the increase of the defense budget to 5% of the GDP, which is insane. So the degrowth is really about reducing this kind of unnecessary investment in military thing. So these are the issues that we can still think how degrowth ideas can be connected with more broader, more important issues that could also improve many people's well-being and so on. Of course, that's not very, closely connected with what Marx said, of course. But yes, I have to choose either side, and this is something more concrete, I would say.
All right, thanks so much. Yeah, I think this would be a good. Yeah, would be a good point to open it to the floor. So, are there any questions? Yeah, do we have a microphone for the audience, or yeah, over there? Over there on the right hand side.
Thanks. Thanks. I really enjoyed the talk and the discussion. And the discussion has already made me understand things much better. I had some of the same concerns that have already come up, I think. But I'll ask it in a different way. So I'm wondering what exactly you're arguing against. And you often talked about the domination of nature. That seemed to be what you're against. So I would like to know what it means to dominate nature, because I'm not sure. So the concept of domination makes sense for me in a context where you dominate another agent with a will. I mean, that's the Republican concept, that someone's will is subject to arbitrary interference. And domination of animals is another question, but I don't see what domination of nature as such is. And it seemed to me that many of the things that you mention as examples throughout don't sound to me like examples of nature being dominated. For example, when you talk about productivism, it seems to me that the problem is that we're doing production for the sake of production. And that's a problem that's unique to capitalism. That's the irrationality of capitalism, that we're producing, but not even in order to satisfy our own needs. So the problem there doesn't seem to be that nature is dominated by us, but that we're dominated by capital. And when you mentioned some of these technophilic communists who talk about some kind of communist techno-utopia, I'm also convinced that those are problematic proposals sometimes. But the problem there seems to be that they're proposing technological solutions which end up destroying nature. And I'm also not sure if we can see that as domination of nature, because the problem rather seems to be that we're not good enough at understanding and controlling nature, because we do things to nature that backfire. So it seems like we lack control, and the solution would be to better understand how nature reacts to our intervention. So in brief, in the end, I think you sort of mentioned the conscious regulation of our metabolism with nature as an alternative to the domination of nature. And I'm wondering what the difference really is between those two things, except that one sounds better than the other.
Yeah, so it's pretty much about the difference of control and domination. And I'm not against controlling, human metabolism with nature. I mean, without doing this, you just constantly fail and they make more disasters. So controlling is somehow necessary, but then after a certain point, it becomes domination. That's there's a difference. And then I think one of the problem with domination is it has to do with this non-identity of nature. It basically denies this non-identity. So it becomes almost identified with yourself, meaning that you can totally manipulate, change, and transform, and so on. But Marx always emphasized that actually nature is something different as a unorganisches Wesen or the unorganisches Körper. This is a kind of different thing that you cannot simply assimilate to yourself, right? And that's one point. And the other problem is when nature is dominated, nature becomes the monopoly for humans. But nature also exists for other animals and other ecosystems, and it's much more, it's not just for humans. But for me, the domination means that nature is kind of becomes an instrument only for humans. It's a human, becomes a human property, I would say. And then Marx in the volume 3 actually has this passage that no one, even all the humans living now, don't have any property right upon the planet because planet doesn't belong to anyone. So that's, but still we have to regulate, but that's not a domination. I would make this difference.
Hi, thanks for that. I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to be concise. And I'll pick up on, so I also, like Thomas, wanted to ask about freedom and nature. So I'm still not sure what makes your concept of ecological freedom. I'm sorry, I don't know. Yeah, can you hear me if I just talk? Yeah. So I'm sorry. Thanks. So in the talk, you said that ecological freedom was surrendering to the fortuitous power of nature. And I think it was very unclear to me how that is a concept of freedom at all, in any ordinary sense of the term. In your conversation with Rahel and Thomas, you sort of built on, you said, well, what I mean is also I want to develop, freedom is the freedom to develop our capacities. But I take it that freedom is non-domination, so Republican freedom and free time are the conditions that allow us to develop our capacities, right? That's what, so the interest in Republican freedom and the interest in free time already is an interest in developing our capacities. So it's not clear how your notion of ecological freedom as surrendering to the fortuitous power of nature can help us develop capacities. So the question is just could you maybe develop the notion of ecological freedom a little bit? And then quickly on the other side of nature, in the talk, you drawing on this passage from Marx, you kept saying that nature is Zufall. And I want to say that that's not Marx's, so in that passage, of course, that's what he says. But that the considered view of Marx and the philosophical context out of which he comes, it's actually very important that nature is not Zufall or Zufälligkeit, and that if nature was only Zufall, that it kind of undermines the very possibility of freedom. It undermines the possibility of thinking of ourselves as a part of nature. And beyond the textual stuff with Marx and German philosophy, I think the idea of nature as just arbitrariness or contingency, basically, is not the concept of nature that any environmental or ecological any ecologically interested critical theory, right, should be working with. And so, yeah, those are the two sides of the freedom, nature. I know that's a lot.
Yeah, I think these two are very well connected. And yeah, what I wanted to do is basically to kind of challenge this conventional idea of modern freedom as nature as some kind of necessity, and then recognizing this necessity of nature becomes the conditions for realizing human freedom. That's like Engels was, following Hegel says. But maybe there will be some kind of, interesting moment when you recognize the finiteness. You cannot control nature fully. is it a negation of freedom? Maybe not, because look at the history. I mean, those people in the Middle Ages or in pre-capitalist societies or Asian societies, they were just so much vulnerable, but they look sometimes so much more free. And then that's what you also like to read, like David Graeber is like so popular because we kind of fascinate, these people actually much more democratic and free, wow, right? So actually these are not necessarily, I don't necessarily think that that kind of a recognition of nature as Notwendigkeit is the condition of freedom. So I wanted to actually say that even in Marx, there is some kind of elements that leads us to open up some dialogue with people like Graeber, maybe. And I'm not also saying that about the first question, I'm not saying that these two, Republican freedom and the free disposable times, are not important or anything like that. These are, of course, conditions of human freedom, of course. What I wanted to say is basically to kind of supplement, because they don't talk about ecology enough. So maybe only by combining these three dimensions, we will have more comprehensive view of Marx's idea of freedom. But in order to do this, you have to pay attention to the last Marx. So then we have much more better vision of communist freedom.
But just to ask you one more question here about this. So is there not a stronger kind of opposition that you have against the idea of freedom as free disposable time? So freedom as non-domination as a condition and important, I can see how this fits in your picture. But I thought that you wanted to say, well, this idea of freedom as being about my free disposable time creates this kind of rift between a realm of necessity and a realm of freedom. And so then we think, well, there is this necessity and we have to deal with it. We can minimize a little bit, but never fully, and we can maximize the realm of freedom. But there is no freedom in the realm of necessity. There is no freedom. And I thought you wanted to resist that and say, well, care work, labor, these are ways in which we realize our freedom. So it's the wrong idea to think of this kind of rift between necessity and freedom.
The Haglund actually has a really good argument on this. So in a free society, either in socialism, once you're free from this kind of domination by capital, even if you work, it can be free time, right? If you think it is important for you, like professors, we work many hours, but it's not necessarily because we want to get paid. It's also fun. So it's a, you don't agree. So it's actually, this kind of freedom that can be both freedom of necessity and freedom of freedom. But in socialism, without domination, these activities can be activities in free time, because then you're spending your time in a meaningful ways with your free decisions. That's what basically Martin Haglund says, and I agree. And this is, I think, compatible with his ideas, and also these Republican ideas. And then I'm trying to supplement this ecological dimension, that maybe we will have more comprehensive view without falling into the danger of, oh yeah, just automate and we will have a party and so on.
Thank you so much for the talk and discussion. I have a question that's very close to what was just discussed, but I'll ask it anyway. And I want to ask about labor, and understand you as you center labor as something that's actually quite nice and would be even nicer under different conditions. And I certainly think that's true. But I still want to ask about labor that extends basic necessity, because I do think there's quite different forms of labor. Like being paid to think is quite different than sweeping the floor. It's kind of a different type of labor and necessary in a different way, right? So what about the changing nature, actually in the Anthropocene, that is possibly, for one thing, extending the necessary labor, as in a lot of like cleaning up and so on, extinguishing fires, I don't know, a lot of like extra labor that's very necessary for basic living, actually. And isn't it limiting or threatening options for labor or activities that are more about deciding how we want to live, which would maybe then include being paid to think? And I would like to know what you would say to that.
Yes, so we have to reorganize a lot what counts as necessary labor, what counts as more, free time and so on. Because in capitalism, only those labors that contribute to the production of surplus value counts basically as necessary labor. So the sphere of reproduction is often like marginalized, and Marx also doesn't talk much about it. But of course, in this future society, that's very essential part, and that's one thing. But also, even in communist or socialist society where there is no more domination, we will have those jobs that no one wants to do, probably. It's likely, right? So these are the things that still count as real freedom of necessity, probably. These are the things that you have to clean the toilets and gather the garbages. And these are, if you want to do it, you should do it for the society, but it's probably not enough to sustain the society. So these are the things that now imposed on those people who are more vulnerable and the low-paid jobs and so on. But in the more higher stage of communism that Marx talks about in the Critique of Gotha program, these jobs will be shared through rotations and so on, and more democratic decision making. Of course, the problem is how it's possible and so on. Of course, there are many problems, but theoretically. But also there is maybe the necessity to automate those things. But today, these automation don't happen because these are done by low-paid people. So there's no incentive to automate these dirty works or unpopular works. But only in socialism, only after liberated from the constant pressure to make more profit, we can maybe democratically decide to automate certain things, even though it is not necessarily very efficient. You might want to go for that because then we as a society have better chance to develop our capacities. Maybe with less resources because you spend a lot of resources in automating these industries. But then we have enough free time without these heavy jobs. Then maybe we spend more time learning music or, I don't know, I sound very romantic. But yes, I just want to say that there are other possibilities that you actually still cultivate with less resources. And these are the important transformation that degrowth communism actually advocate for.
We do have time for one or two more questions, I think.
Hello. First, I want to thank you for the presentation. I got acquainted to your work some years ago when it was published in Brazil. From there, my question would be to say, like, when you say degrowth, it's easy to, not easy, the right word, but to see that in a perspective of Europe, that degrowth, because you have a well-established, for example, transport system, and okay, expand the U-Bahn, the S-Bahn, okay, but what happens when you don't have the transportation system at all? Because, for example, in Brazil, you don't have a bus transportation system that connects the whole city. And that is common in Latin America itself. So my question to you would be, what would be the preconditions to start degrowing? Because if you take for Brazil, okay, let's a revolution take place and whatever, we would to actually brutally industrialized to be able to then degrowth. So it's not the same condition as Russia and the Soviet Union or semi-failed that have the ability to industrialize itself by whatever stake was at the time. So didn't care about the ecology or whatever, they just industrialized. And if I had this limitation, how could we grow to a point of redistribution, nearly as the idea of Europe or something, to be able to degrowth? So
No, I totally understand. In the countries, I mean, Brazil is now growing fast, and it's getting bigger and bigger. But still, in those countries, Latin America or in South Asia, of course in Africa, these societies do need a lot of investment for decent life, but not for affluent life. First, we have to, yes, set certain kind of standards. There are like a lot of discussions about the minimums, what's the conditions for decent life, and there are also statistics and so on. And then we can use those things to measure. Actually, we need more transportation in Brazil, but we need more hospitals in Africa. And so these are the things that still requires a lot of economic growth, but also resource energy consumption. So that's obviously not degrowth, it's a kind of growth. But I would say this is not, of course, necessarily a capitalist growth. It's a different, it's just a way of preparing the material condition, the social infrastructure that are simply necessary for decent life. And it's not for the sake of profit per se, it's just rather the economy governed by needs. The problem is after a certain point, this becomes more and more for the sake of profit, for the sake of economic growth, which becomes more and more destructive, irrational, and so on. And this is a stage where many rich countries like Germany, US, of course, but Japan are now heading. And it's time to rather maintain the existing infrastructures that we have and also to accommodate to the new climate catastrophe and so on. That still also requires a lot of investment. That is why I don't think that we have enough extra resources to invest for building new outbound or something, right? So that's how we actually need more democratic economic planning. That is actually the topic of my next book, because capitalism doesn't have this kind of planning only for the sake of, they do, but they're only for the sake of single companies, and they don't have any democratic decision making to decide what to invest and how, what kind of society we want to achieve. There's no single answer. We might want to have a society with more footballs, to like court that you can play soccer, and then maybe Japan with more baseball, players and so on. But these we can actually democratically decide, not decided by certain politicians and capitalists and so on. So I mean, these are some kind of transformation that I want to discuss more. And then especially a country like Brazil has an immense possibility to do this kind of planning, and there's already example in Ecuador that they try to do this kind of ecological planning, which actually failed, but still they had more planning to build what kind of infrastructures, focusing on what, and protecting indigenous people's rights and so on. So I think they would have the capacity and the possibility to actually realize different model of development than compared to global north countries. So there's actually very interesting thing going on. So I'm not saying that degrowth should impose limits to those global south countries. They should remain poor. No, I think we need more dialogues. I think we can learn from each other.
I mean, now you sound as if your position was abolishing capitalism more than abolishing growth.
Of course.
As again, yeah. No, but I mean, when we say, of course, we need growth in this area.
Sometimes when I talk about when I talk about Deutsche Bahn, I don't sound very radical. But I think it's also like a policies that you can also still implement that could have the wider consequences about the mobility and how you spend your free time and the money and so on. That could have capacity to open up more progressive policies. While, of course, the ultimate goal should be the abolition of this unequal imperial rules, and then it's finally overcoming capitalism.
But just to the point, so it seemed like if you say degrowth communism, we could think it's about degrowing, period. Stop growth. But what you want to stop is growth for growth's sake or production for production's sake. So this kind of logic, but it doesn't mean that certain kinds of regions in the world do not still need growth. They do need growth. But we do not need the kind of growth that we excessively produce in this world, growth for growth's sake or production for production's sake.
Yes, I guess that's why people like Cedric Duron, he was also in Hamburg at the New Institute, and we had a debate, and he doesn't use the term degrowth so much. Rather, he uses this concept, planification écologique, so the ecological planning. Gives some more idea that you actually still invest, still produce many things, but not for the sake of profit, but with paying attention to various dimensions. And then maybe, yes, once we have more concrete vision, we don't have to use this vague term degrowth. Not that I like this term. Every time I have to explain, but it's a useful term because it kind of creates some space of reflection.
Thank you so much for creating this space of reflection with us tonight. And thanks for coming. Thanks for the lecture. And thank you all for being part of this and for the discussion.
Thank you, Rahel and Thomas, and thank you for coming.